I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I can't see any of you, and I think that's probably okay. My name, for those of you who don't remember, is Pat Juvenile. I'm the moderator for today's, this afternoon's presentation, and I'm super excited about it. And I'm going to do this the same way we did this in the last panel. I'm going to introduce each speaker before they speak. So our first speaker today, where's our first speaker? Judge Gaston is our first
the women judges now.
Yes. And so, pardon me, my eyesight's very bad, so I'm going to read this. It's going to sound like I'm reading it because I am. So, Judge Gaston spent 5 years in a juvenile courtroom where she heard cases involving child abuse and neglect. Prior to becoming a judge, Judge Gaston worked as a deputy public defender and represented a 10-year-old who was charged with murder and was diagnosed with FASD. This began her interest in the topic. And I will leave it there and invite her to come up and speak.
All right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I have the coveted afternoon spot. But my education with around fetal alcohol spectrum disorders began, as Pat said, with homicide. In 2011, I was assigned for the first time as a public defender to our office's Juvenile Justice Department. At that point, I had been a lawyer for about 15 years, and one of the first cases I was assigned was this 10-year-old who had been playing video games with his best friend. It's time for best friend to go home. He doesn't want best friend to go home. He removes a knife from the kitchen, stabs to death his best friend. These were neighbors. This was devastating to the entire community, the families who knew one another. And I'm not telling you anything confidential that hasn't been reported in the press, because this child, Micah, had an adoptive mother who was very, very engaged. She was an advocate within the fetal alcohol spectrum community, and so she knew to educate me as Micah's lawyer. Micah's mother introduced me to Drs. Kim Jones and Tina Chambers, who introduced me to Billy Edwards, who introduced me to Drs. Brown and Greenspan, and thus began my education with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And I am embarrassed to say that when I was originally assigned to Micah's case, I thought that was the first client I had ever had with fetal alcohol syndrome. How embarrassing. Because once I knew what to look for, using things like the checklist developed by Dr. Brown, I realized that it was everywhere. So many of my juvenile clients suffered from this disorder. And so let me ask you, have you met this 15-year-old? He's been diagnosed with ADHD, bipolar, schizophrenia, substance abuse disorder, depression, anxiety, and my least favorite diagnosis of all time, oppositional defiant disorder, okay? He's been on 10 different medications, and the caregivers tell you, but nothing works, right? That was most of my juvenile caseload. And I started doing things like I heard the practitioner asking about, who would ask his clients to estimate distance. I started asking my kids, if I gave you 5 $20 bills, how much is that? And if they couldn't tell me, I sent them to Dr. Jones for an evaluation. All right, so with his help, we did a little pilot project at the public defender's office with the help of probation that seemed to indicate that about 20% of the kids going to our juvenile hall had fetal alcohol syndrome. It's probably higher than that. We had some methodological problems. But this did become something of a passion project, for me at least. Before I leave from what I learned from the juvenile justice system, I will say I was aided very much by a gifted investigator at the public defender's office. If you are working with moms, you need somebody like my investigator, Dina. She was a mom whisperer, and she knew how to ask those questions. Somebody just asked in the last session, how do you get this information out of the biological mom? And Dina was empathetic and kind and did not make them feel like trash. She also had as a technique asking them, hey, he was born in 2010. Around that time in your life, were you partying a lot? What were you doing? And she would get the partying history and leave it, and then circle back and say, how far along were you when you realized you were pregnant? Which was a very sophisticated way of us getting at what the alcohol and drug consumption pattern was for my clients without making the moms feel bad about themselves. Fast forward, I'm put on the bench by Governor Jerry Brown, and I'm assigned to a dependency department where I'm working with these kids who, according to the government, have been abused or neglected. And I'm also working with juvenile justice kids, the same type of kid that I had represented as a lawyer. And we started trying to institutionalize some things to try to figure out where these kids were. So I'm going to tell you about 5 of the things that we accomplished, more or less, while I was in the juvenile court. One is we created a local rule that said if you are an attorney representing children in the child welfare system, again, if you are an attorney, you're being appointed by the court, you must be educated on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. That is a rule now in San Diego. So every single attorney working with those children in the child welfare system, Jennifer, who was asking, okay, all those lawyers now at least know what to look for. Number 2, we expanded these screenings through child welfare. Every child who was removed from a biological parent in my county was routinely sent for a developmental screening. The developmental screening didn't include an assessment for fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And when I initially started saying, hey, can you get this kid screened for this? People didn't really know what I was talking about. You have to develop the grooves and create the relationships and the connections so that people know who they're supposed to call when someone asks for that kind of assessment. And so we did operationalize, making that, we kind of normalized that if there were red flags out there, that the child should not just receive a routine developmental screening, but should be sent to the extra level screening for fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Another thing that we did is that we implemented a screening process for all of our juvenile institutions. When kids are arrested and brought to juvenile hall, they get a pediatric assessment, they weigh them, they measure them. We added fetal alcohol spectrum disorder to that. Supposedly, I'll get back to that in a minute. We added a section in our probation office reports. We do in California something called a social study before a child can be sentenced. We don't call it sentencing them because there are a lot of euphemisms in juvenile court. But in any event, we do this thing called a social study that tells you a lot about the kid. We added a bullet point, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. So there is supposed to be at least, it's supposed to at least remind people that they should be looking for this. That's been more or less successful, but it's there. It is in black and white in the San Diego County Social Studies. We also supercharged our training. We started doing trainings of all of the attorneys on both sides of the house in juvenile. We started training our attorneys, our judges. We also have what are called CASAs in California or throughout the United States, court-appointed special advocates. These are wonderful people who volunteer to spend their time with a child who's in the system. And we started training the CASAs because the CASAs are truly uniquely positioned, spend a lot of different time with the kids in a lot of different settings, and can really be the court's eyes and ears in detecting some of these red flags for us. So those were the 5 things that we tried to do in the juvenile justice system. Now, that all sounds great. It is great. It's a good first step. Here are some of the problems. I am told that since we implemented screening at our juvenile institutions, 0 children have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. All right, so we've got a training problem there, and it's particularly frustrating because Doctors Jones and Chambers literally have a clinic around the corner from our juvenile hall. They have offered to do free screenings. I don't know why we're still utilizing screeners who don't know fetal alcohol syndrome when they see it, but we are. Also, a lot of the things we implemented are very individual dependent. And I think we've heard about this today, right? The judge who implements this great process in his court retires and nobody does it anymore. The police officer who, if they leave, somebody new has to be trained to do it because it's not operational, it's not institutionalized. And I think that's part of the frustration we're hearing today, is that so much of this is dependent on us as individuals and our passion and our concern about this area, when what we really need to be doing is creating rules, whether at the local level, the county level, the state level, the national level, to make sure that these kids are being assessed, as Dr. Brown was saying, by their pediatricians within their school systems and within our juvenile justice and child welfare systems. It has to be written down, because if one of us gets hit by a bus, we need to make sure that the next day the same processes are still being followed. We know, according to the 2018 JAMA paper that was released by Dr. Chambers, among others, that it's at least 3% of the population in a regular first grade class. All right, so it's not like these kids aren't already out there. They're out there. We're just failing to diagnose them. So you may get the question, if you're passionate about this issue, what's the point of diagnosing these kids? What are we going to do anyway? Because if it's brain damage, what can we do differently? Well, and my answer to that is quite a lot. In the juvenile justice system, getting back to Micah, the kid that I had who had stabbed his friend, there were some little things like most kids who were in a juvenile institution could be told, if you behave this week, you get to go to movie night on Saturday. Anybody here think that would work with somebody like Micah? But he liked Sunny D, the drink. It's disgusting. It's like a really super sweet orange drink. But he could behave himself for a couple of hours at a time if he got a little cup of Sunny D. All right, so, and the folks in our institution were willing to work with him in that way, and that was helpful to him. We also were able to convince the court that he shouldn't be processed and prosecuted as a neurotypical child would maybe have been. I mean, he was 10, so don't get me started. Anyway, he went to a residential treatment facility that was equipped to deal with his special needs, where he got to go to school, he got to see his mom, he got to interact with other kids. He was eventually reunified with his mom, and I am proud to tell you, last spring graduated from high school. So he is living with his mom. And had it not been for her advocacy and for the doctors who rallied around him and helped educate me, and we educated the court, that could have gone very, very differently and hurt him. In the dependency system, I will tell you this, the kids that we would see, of course you can detect this disorder at 6, at 8, at 10, but where we see it most frequently on the child welfare side is the kids who have so-called blown out of placement, right? Aunt Mary feels like she just can't handle this child anymore, or grandpa just feels like they can't handle this child anymore. And one of the most pernicious things, one of the most horrible things about misdiagnosis is that the kid just thinks they're a bad kid, right? And the caregiver, what do the caregivers think? I'm just terrible at this. I must not be the right caregiver for this child. And when you're able to tell them, no, it's not you, and it's not her, this is brain damage, you can feel the relief. It breathes new life into these relationships because these kids love their caregivers and the caregivers love them. So it is worth doing well, and I am privileged to be among you here today. I am yours in the fight.
Wowzers, right on time too. So impressive. Okay, now we have, I'm so sorry about my reading, but now we have Judge Susan Carlson. In addition to being Minnesota's First Lady from 1990 to 1999, Susan Carlson is an attorney and retired Hennepin County,
Minnesota.
Hennepin County Juvenile District Court Judicial Officer. It was through her experience in juvenile court that led to Minnesota's efforts in combating the harmful effects of prenatal alcohol exposure. I'm going to stop there and let her give her presentation. And I have a 3-minute and then a 1 minute.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'm chairman now, chair of the board of FASD United, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank you all for coming to this conference. And thank you for being at the Justice session. I've been involved in this journey for over 2.5 decades, starting in 1997. And people will wonder, well, Susan, why have you continued to do this? And I think, looking at all you, I think you all know the answer. Once you become involved, and I have to, follow Judge Gaston, you can't give it up because you know that what you're doing is right. And so, but I began this journey as a juvenile court referee, which is we have specialty judges in juvenile court. So I began that, and I began that with the detention calendar. And I saw a lot of kids that came that were, detention is when they're running away from placements, probation violations, and I would get thick reports, and you'd see a lot of history, and that perked my interest. On a personal level, and I haven't been open about that, my husband's first wife had a substance abuse disorder and gave birth to a healthy 7-pound baby who died of SIDS at 21 days. And that was before the recognition of FAS. But we know now that that's one of the biggest causes of FASD is for SIDS. So that, along with the personal experience. And I was fortunate at the time that I was a judicial officer to also be First Lady of Minnesota. And that certainly does help with your platform. And so I've been on this journey, and I'm a policy wonk. And if you look at, we're talking about research, policy to practice. And policy, and I just want to thank the parent, because we need a commitment by our governments in countries around the world to invest in this disability. I mean, it's pathetic, frankly. And I've spent the last 3 years in the policy arena meeting with members of Congress in the United States and their staff, telling them the stories, along with, and parents that are in this room today, telling the stories that we've been hearing for all these years. Anyway, so I want to talk about do I have a button to push?
Oh, for your president, I don't know.
They didn't.
Sorry.
I don't know, can I? Okay, all right. So screening and identification. It's not part of our system in any of our systems to screen for FASD. You know that, we all know that. We do things differently. There's systems, there's silos. And there's obviously the challenges of getting the information. I don't need to tell you any of the information that's on that slide. So that's what was happening back in 2005. I'm talking about we had a FASD Center for Excellence in the United States. It's gone. We lost our funding for it in 2016. That's in the FASD Respect Act. If you're in the United States, join the bandwagon. We're trying to get that passed to reinstitute the FASD Center for Excellence. Part of that funding, and Dan's very aware of this, there were projects funded through the Center for Excellence, 5 juvenile justice projects, and Hennepin County, Minnesota, that's in the middle of, Hennepin County is Minneapolis and suburbs, okay? So we got funding started as 1 year, and it ended up being about 6 years. And you can read the slides. I'm not going to read the slides to you, but it was designed to find out more information about FASD in the juvenile justice system and to prompt other research. It was not a research study, no control numbers. And so we began, and I took a year off the bench to be project director for the first year. And we screened youth that were referred to what we called project support. And those were kids that had a lot of problems in the home. They were low-level offenders. We couldn't just start screening every child that was adjudicated. And we made the decision at the very beginning to screen only those that had been adjudicated through in the court. And so that year, we ended up screening a lot more than we could handle in interventions. And so in the second or the third year, we had to change how we were screening kids. So we started screening those that screened positive on the MACI-2. And 46 states in the US use the MACI-2. And so any kid that screened positive on the MACI-2 was referred for the FASD screen. And then there was the FASD Center did an expert panel, and Dr. Riley was part of that expert panel, and I'll just show you a little bit on that. And you can see this, and it was a very simple screen. I mean, we had our big screen out because we have like 5,000 that come through the justice system in Hennepin County. And so you can read, so you would screen those that had prenatal alcohol exposure, and then it got down to whether they had education and behavior problems. And so that was the screen, and then and this was a form that the social workers would do. It had to be a quick 30-minute screen. It couldn't be anything more complicated. And so they would spend time with the youth and with the parents. We had no problems getting information from either the caregiver at that time or the birth mother. Because, you know, when they get to that stage, they want answers, and so they're willing to give out that information. So we had no issues with getting prenatal alcohol exposure. And and this was all voluntary. They had to sign waivers, these were our goals, and that was part of, we got a lot of money to do this, and so it was screening and referral and treatment, increase our capacity. So what did we accomplish? So we had partnerships. We had a task force made up of all the different players within the justice system in Hennepin County, including the court. The court was a really important part of that. And the bench, and just like Judge Gaston, they began to look at it as a disability and modify their dispositions. And so it really began to work. This became what I would call kind of a Cadillac system. If you're going to figure out how do you screen and identify in juvenile court and what to do, this would be the model. And we had Minneapolis Public Schools had a program where we had a person in the schools who was FASD informed to work with the parents and the school, making sure their intervention plan was appropriate. And all the contracted services in Hennepin County had to be FASD informed. And these are the results. How are we doing on time? 3 minutes. Okay. And I'm just giving you the data for 2008 to 2012. Because in just 2006 alone, we had over 327 that we screened. And so as you can see, we had to narrow that down because we could not provide the services. So we had 170 youth that were screened, 45% screened positive, and 87% completed their diagnosis. And I think in a big system, and we were fortunate because we had a good relationship with the University of Minnesota Diagnostic Clinic. So it went quite smoothly. And 30% on an average screened positive on the Macy and then screened for FASD. So that I think is a pretty good number. And about 90% of those that were referred by the court and by probation screened positive. And most of them, the majority, had prenatal alcohol exposure, maternal history, school performance, and there were only 2 out of all that we screened that had a rank of 3 or 4 in the face, because we did the facial screen where we took the picture, and there were only 2 that had that. And this is the demographic. I just put that in there so you'll be able to look and see, but we have a large percentage of African Americans, and that was the biggest number. But there's a lot of good data. Unfortunately, all of that material that went to the Center for Excellence is gone. This is from my archives. And those are what happened after a youth got diagnosed. And these are the results. And they're small, and I don't know if you can read them very well, but I got 1 minute left. We're almost there. And I can't read it very well down there, but these numbers are impressive. 70% had no new offenses. I mean, that is remarkable when you think about it. And most of the, when I went back and started looking at the data, the offenses were more often than not disorderly conduct and domestic abuse. And so you can see the numbers, and I'll make sure that if you want this PowerPoint, you'll be able to get it. And the school numbers were equally impressive. Increased attendance, 61%. Reduction in suspensions, 83%. I mean, and this was over that 4-year period. So 78% were found to be completed. They completed what we call their intervention plans. And finally, this questions and challenges for the field. And I hope that we'll have, should we be doing universal screening in juvenile court, all kids? Last year, in 2019, there were 696,000 arrests of juveniles in the United States. There were 386 petitions juvenile in 2019. Residential placement, 55,000. Probation, 132. Those are big numbers, folks. I don't know that we can do that, but maybe we can start looking at and using the Macy. This has to be systemic, and we've heard that. You've got to figure out how to be systemic. That's it.
I feel a lot smarter.
Yeah, a lot of it.
Okay, but our next, Dan, I don't know how to pronounce your surname. Dubovsky. Dan Dubovsky is our next speaker, and on a personal note, I just want to let you all know that Dan has taught me so much, and I'm a much better lawyer for having heard the things he's had to tell me. Not me personally, because he doesn't know who I am, but I have gone and listened to him many, many times. He's awesome. So he has worked for over 50 years in the field of behavioral health and direct care worker and did I see 50? Yes, over 50 years, whoa. Behavioral health as a direct care worker and a therapist. He's been involved in FASD for over 35 years. For 14 years, he was the FASD specialist for the U.S. FASD Center of Excellence. For his work in FASD, his son Bill has been his mentor and his best teacher.
Thanks, Pat, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. I did start when I was 3 years old. I just want to let you know that. A child prodigy. A couple of things I want to share just from, again, personal experience that really reflects what you've heard today up until now and why we need to pay attention to this. At one point when my son turned 18, he wanted to get a car, and I told him that if he got his car, that if he got a ticket in the first 6 months that he had his car, then he would not have enough money then to pay his registration and his insurance, and he would lose his car. So about 2 months after he got his car, he was driving and he got stopped by the police. And the police officer went back to his police car to write him a ticket, and Bill remembered what I told him. My dad said, if I get a ticket, I won't be able to keep my car. So what did he do? He took off. And of course the police officer chased after him, and he got arrested for fleeing an officer. Because, very literal, he did exactly what, if I'm not here, I can't get a ticket, right? Makes perfect sense. The other was that another time, he was somewhere where he wasn't supposed to be. The police came and said, move, get out of here. He didn't respond immediately, so the police officer grabbed him. He hit the police officer and ended up in shackles in the hole in jail for 30 days for trespassing. You don't get too many people in shackles in the hole in jail for 30 days for trespassing, but the issue was twofold. One is we know in FASD that processing information takes longer, especially verbal information, so that when somebody doesn't respond immediately, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are oppositional. It may mean that they haven't processed the information yet. And the other is that so many individuals with FASD have experienced trauma, and the only time Bill would ever get physically aggressive is if somebody grabbed him. And his automatic response was to hit them. So that was just 2 examples of why we need to recognize FASD and why we need to respond differently, like giving the person more time and checking for true understanding. The other 2 things I want to say before I forget, so I'm going to say it at the beginning because I won't have time at the end, is that if we recognize individuals with FASD and provide the right interventions, it improves outcomes for those individuals, it improves outcomes for their families, and improves outcomes for the justice system and every other system working with them. We have to keep that in mind. This absolutely makes a difference. And the other is that I say this a lot, is that whenever anybody, this includes attorneys, it includes judges, it includes everybody else, it includes clinicians. Whenever we are dealing with a behavior, I don't care what the behavior is, the first question we have to ask and get an answer to is what is causing this behavior for this individual at this time. If you cannot identify that, you cannot come up with an appropriate intervention. And we rarely do that. Most of the time we see a behavior and we respond to the behavior. You broke the law, here's the consequence. Then you'll learn not to break the law. We know that doesn't work, especially in FASD. And we don't figure out what's causing the behavior. I wrote and taught courses on youth and violence and found that there were a number of people in jail for violent behavior where we found that there were tumors in the hippocampus or the amygdala of their brain. And when those tumors were removed, they had no more violent behavior. And they could have been consequence for the rest of their life. It wouldn't have stopped the violent behavior. And then there was a young girl who murdered her stepsister. And they found that piercing cries set off seizure activity in the temporal lobes of her brain. And when that seizure disorder was correctly treated, she had no more violent behavior. We have to figure out what's causing the behavior before we can identify an appropriate response. Okay, I'm probably out of time now. So what I'm here to talk about is a project in recognizing FASD. How do we recognize FASD in various populations? And this started a long time ago when I was working with substance use treatment centers to identify adults in treatment with FASD, and ended up with my colleagues Therese Grant and Nancy Whitney, the University of Washington, developing a screen called the Life History Screen. And I'll talk more about that tomorrow morning. We have a session where we're going to talk about that and give you more of the history. And then have adapted that and used that in a number of different settings. And a couple of years ago had the opportunity in the state of Pennsylvania where one of the counties got some funding through the System of Care grant, which in the U.S. are grants through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to address children and adolescents. And they took some of that System of Care money to implement a project in the county juvenile probation office to identify the youth who come through juvenile probation who have a probable FASD, and to implement modifications to approaches and to work with them. Now, in Pennsylvania, we have one FASD diagnostic center for the entire state. So we know our diagnostic capacity is minuscule compared to the prevalence of FASD. We cannot wait for diagnosis to intervene because we're ruining people's lives while we do that. So we created this. Now, from my experience, this is really a pretty unique juvenile probation office because it's a very hands-on, active probation office where they take kids to their appointments, they check on them regularly. So intervening with some of the strategies really fit with them. So they did start to screen youth, and if a screen was positive, then they would assess them for a probable FASD. The screen is about 5 or 6 quick questions to ask. And then the assessment. And then if they assess positive for a probable FASD, then we intervene with a strengths and strategies approach. Because the other thing that we know with all of you who work in the field, especially in the field of juvenile justice or adult justice, is that So many of these kids have heard repeatedly over their life what they've done wrong, and often they have never heard what they've done right. So part of this approach is beginning by talking with them about what they've done right on a regular basis, at least 5 or 6 times a day, telling them what they've done right, and not constantly only telling them what they've done wrong and what they need to do differently. So that's the first step, with a positive assessment for probable FASD. And the life history screen was validated in Germany, actually, with 2 women who wanted to use it for their thesis. And it was found to be 87.5% accurate in identifying those with or without an FASD, which is really pretty good for a screening for FASD. I was excited to hear those statistics because in the U.S. nobody's funded that kind of study. So those who are assessed as having a probable FASD, then the first step is to do a strength assessment. Do a strength assessment with the youth, and also a separate strength assessment with the caregiver. Never do them together, but separately. One of the fascinating things in one of the residential treatment programs that was shared with me by Summer, who you'll hear from if you come to our session tomorrow morning, was a young man who, when they did the strengths assessment in residential treatment, the young man thought that the staff saw nothing positive about him, and the staff did identify things positive that then could be shared with him, because we want to build self-esteem and confidence in these youth. That's really essential. 3 minutes, okay. And then once that's done, then we implement strategies based on and use a strengths and strategies approach. So if we identify the strengths in the youth, in the family, or whoever the caregivers are, in the community, and in the providers, then we use a combination of strengths and strategies to modify the environment so they can be successful. So this is different than other youth where we want them to change their behavior. That doesn't work in FASD. It sets people up to fail. We need to modify their environment so they can be successful. And we can get plenty of examples of that. In talking with the director of the JPO office, now the funding is run out, they're still doing their screening and assessment. Their frustration is, okay, now they're identifying these youth and the services that these youth are involved with, the residential programs that they're involved with through justice, juvenile justice, the schools programs don't understand FASD. And so part of the problem is funding for training, but the other part, what was shared with me, was that they don't think they have a need. Just like that, nobody has FASD. We don't need to see this. And we need to figure out, how do we reach child welfare? How do we reach corrections? How do we reach education? Because they are essential. Because we can't even work with these youth and provide wonderful supports if then we're sending them back out without those supports and without people who understand it. So I was really excited that this is the only JPO office that I know of that's doing screening and assessment and then interventions and modifying approaches with the understanding of the brain basis of FASD. And as Justin said, it really is how their brain processes information. So if you want more information, feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.
You got a minute.
Oh, I have a minute. Oh, okay. I have a minute. So, what do you all think? How's the weather? Really nice and... No, sorry.
We'll leave it for questions.
Anyway, yeah, if you want to contact me, my email is ddubovksy. My name is SKY. My email is ksy @verizon.net. And I have my card if anyone wants it. So, and thank you all for being here. And thank you all for wanting to do this, because the more people we get to do this, the more we can spread the word.
Okay. Now, if you guys listened to me this morning, you heard that I said we were going to hear some information about suggestibility this afternoon. So I'm very excited about this. So Dr. David Jr. Gilbert is our next speaker. He is an interdisciplinary researcher at the University Fellow in the School of Health and Society, thank you, sorry, at the University of Salford. Gilbert has a keen interest in FASD and the justice system research, and sorry, because I have to keep scrolling, and to focus on interrogative suggestibility, compliance, and confabulation in the FASD population.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. My name is Gilbert. Today, this afternoon, I'm not here to tell you anything you don't know already, but I will just be sharing a few stories about my observation with individuals of FASD whom I did assess during my PhD with respect to suggestibility, confabulation, compliance, and vulnerabilities to and within justice system encounters. And I think before I start, I just want to take the time to really appreciate the elders sat in the room. I, as an early career researcher, and I think a lot of us share the same sentiment, we do appreciate all the work you've done, all your passion, all the perseverance to sort of build a foundation for the work we do today. I personally remain very grateful, and I just wanted to take the opportunity this afternoon while some are seated here to express that sense of gratitude and appreciation. So I will be telling 3 stories, and hopefully I'll be able to merge all of that together to make sense within the time we have. I've spent 1 minute of my 15 minutes. It's all right, I'll do my best.
12.
Is it 12 now? All right. I think I should get some extra time because the platform seems a bit shorter. I don't know if I'm too tall, or at least I should get extra time for that. But essentially, I first of all wanted to start off with what we've heard time and time again, and I think Dr. Julian started off brilliantly this morning by telling us how IQ is being overused in the court systems. And essentially, it doesn't tell the whole story. And we know, again, Professor Greenspan here and Natalie, the excellent work they did on trying to sort of delineate how FASD sort of relates with the concept of intellectual disability. So firstly, what I did do for this study was to really delve into the issue of suggestibility and confabulation, which tomorrow afternoon, I think I have a 90-minute session to sort of really explain very deeply how this was undertaken. But it's essentially an experimental assessment of how adolescents with FASD, compared to a neurotypical control group, would react to interviewing or interrogative situation where police officers are interviewing them. And I did use the Gudjonson Suggestibility Scale, which was developed by Professor Beasley Gudjonson, who thankfully had remained or still remains a very pivotal help to my work. He advised the experiment and is still as a mentor to me. So essentially, what I did do was to have a sample. I think the total sample was about 52. And what I did find out, first of all, was the fact that the sample, the FASD sample, none of them had IQs that would be required to fall within the intellectual disability range. So no one fell below 70. This was really, of course, it's been reported in the FASD literature already, that IQs in FASD, in the FASD population is a range. I did see that essentially in also the sample I did use. The second point I wanted to raise is the point about frontal lobe paradox, which of course to neuropsychologists start listening is not a new terminology, but we do know that in 1985, Walsh did sort of delineate and coin that term, frontal lobe paradox, to explain how individuals with frontal lobe lesions or injury or sort of how they've been traumatized on the frontal lobe would actually retain very good features, things like they could speak well, they would actually show very good results in neuropsychological assessments. But when it comes to daily living, when it comes to daily functional tasks, they were always lagging behind. And in my assessment, I did see an indication of this with the sample I did assess, in the sense that they did actually prove very eloquent, they proved very confident, they proved I mean, in justice system context, I think professionals who don't know about FASD will actually think that these individuals were neurotypical because they will speak to me, they will tell me, stories. But then I think it leads to the third point, which I wanted to quickly make. And the point is, when it came to the assessment of suggestibility, so essentially the study was sort of designed in a way that would mirror, in quotes, what the real justice system process would look like. So I assessed them immediately, and I asked them to come back after 7 days to reassess what their suggestibility would look like. I asked them to come back after 7 days, so I would actually assess what the confabulation would look like after time. And of course, this is based on the premise, which we all know, that justice system processes don't just finish in 1 day. So you are asked to come back to repeat, to sort of keep just expanding on what led to those encounters. And of course, as part of that process, the level of their memory recall was actually assessed. And again, tomorrow, hopefully, I'll be able to explain that in detail, how after 1 week, we started to see real differences in confabulation. And what we did see was at immediate assessments, there was no difference between the FASD group and the control group. But then after 1 week, we then started seeing very remarkable level of confabulation that the story I did tell them as part of the assessment, the versions we were getting back was absolutely, completely, and in no way similar to the versions I did tell them a week ago. Aside confabulation, I did assess what is also known as distortion. So in essence, we know confabulation sort of represents how that lack of memory, that ability to memorize or remember events, would be replaced by very fictitious memories. But with distortion is an attempt to actually assess the extent of deviation from details in terms of the minute details. So, for instance, you tell a gentleman with FASD that the bicycle was red, and it tells you that actually the color of the bicycle is black. Now, that represents distortion because the real central element of the story, being bicycle, is retained, but then he has misconstrued the color of the bicycle. Now, when that was measured, essentially, both immediately and after 1 week, I did see that both the FASD group and the control group actually did show levels of distortion. And I think it was Dr. Julian or one of the earlier speakers who said, even for us, or for individuals rather, who have brains that have not been traumatized by alcohol or any other factors, we are still subject to some of these misconstrues in memory. But when it came to the other factor that was assessed, which is fabrication, that was where the drama began. Because fabrication in itself is a concept that talks about the deviation from the material element of the story, in the sense that, so I'll give you a practical example, which again I will explain tomorrow. The story was about a boy on a bicycle going down a hill, his brakes were broken, he was asking for help, and a couple came to help him. But then the versions I was getting back from the population with FASD, sometimes you hear a young person telling you there were witches in the story, there were dogs barking, there were children fighting, and all sorts of versions. Now, we all know as individuals who are interested in this sort of area of inquiry, that represents very, very self-incriminating tendencies. And again, the literature in criminology generally tells us that confabulation represents one of the greatest contaminants to the testimony of suspects, witnesses, and victims of crime. Why do we have all of this on the table to discuss this afternoon? I think for me, as an early career researcher, I was essentially very moved by what I saw. It was absolutely unbelievable to think of what all these vulnerabilities I assessed and saw will translate to in real life situations. And what I mean by this is, my assessment of interrogative suggestibility was remote. It was done over a computer, it was done over the internet, and yet I could clearly see very unmatchable difference between these two populations. The confabulation, 3 minutes, thank you. The confabulation was remarkable. The distortion fabrication was something else, and then compliance. And again, compliance is another concept that is really subtle in the sense that with suggestibility, the individual is actually completely, he has believed the suggestions you've given them, or you've given him or her. But with compliance, they actually know that the answers they are giving you is just to please you. They know essentially the answers are false. So there's a sense of consciousness, which again I measured. I measured compliance, but it's a different story. 2 minutes now. So I think for me really, it sort of spurred my interest to investigate this a bit more, because in remote assessments, I did see this level of vulnerability. Then, if you think of what this will translate to in real life situations, then you know, if you have a small room with an investigator in uniform, you know, in applying interrogative pressure, debunking the testimonies with all the legal backing to actually lie to this suspect who has been impacted by FASD, then essentially you have the perfect recipe for miscarriage of justice. Based on this, I think I will finish. I think it has prompted a bit of an international collaboration at this moment. And some of the seniors sat in the room, Natalie, Paul, and Valerie, all of them from Canada, the UK, US, New Zealand, and Australia. We are starting off a new study to investigate interrogative suggestibility in these 5 countries, where we want to essentially, hopefully, we can come out with very strong consensus statements as an international collaboration about these vulnerabilities so that the justice system around the world will hear us. There's a QR code. If anyone is interested to contribute to this study, you are most welcome. And I think the guys at the back will flash it on the screen. But that's the story I have to tell. IQ essentially is not everything, as has been said by many of the speakers before. Wider vulnerabilities need to be checked. Interview situations, conditions need to be modified. And it is not just anecdotal speech, it's something that has been experimentally proven. And that's the story I come with this afternoon. Thank you so much for listening.
I think we have, he's much taller than me. I think we have, what, 8 minutes for questions left? Is that right? Or do we have any time? With 3 minutes, okay. 5, okay, we're gonna split it in the middle for 5. Who's got, I totally can't see, so someone just do this if you're looking for, okay, right there.
My question is for Judge Gaston. I was wondering if you could speak more about working with CASAs and what that intervention looked like.
Okay, so for those who don't know, CASAs, court-appointed special advocates, are volunteers who are paired with a child or a sibling set in our child dependency system. California is lucky. We have a pretty robust CASA system. There are CASAs throughout the United States. We are trying to get CASAs appointed to kids who are in the juvenile justice system. The training that we have been giving them is basically to educate them in what to look for so that then they can ask for the screening and push for that. So it's 2 separate things, I guess, that we would say are the focuses of the training. One is what to look for. The other is telling them to be really, really bossy and demanding and not take no for an answer, because I think one of the recurring themes this morning that I'm hearing is that there's a lot of pushback for some reason when people say, I think this may be a problem. And so giving these CASAs the permission to walk into court and say, I am not leaving here until I have a phone number, this child needs to be assessed. Yeah. All right.
Elizabeth Elliott, I'm a paediatrician from Australia, and we found in our juvenile justice system 36% of children have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, but none of them have been diagnosed before getting to that purpose. And I'm just raising the point about screening that you talked about. Really, I think it's way too late to be screening and diagnosing, as we all agree, when children get to the justice system. And I wonder if you can think about a way in which we might increase screening at birth, increase screening when children go into foster care or child protection, increase screening prior to school. We have a national Australian Early Developmental Index, which we do, and then screening at the very first contact with the justice system. It needs a lot of portfolios to get together to do, but I wonder if you can see that as being a solution rather than having to deal with children once they've already entered the justice system. Well, I don't know.
I think that's an excellent question. And I know that when we did our screen, because of the issue with funding and the concern about representation, we did, the adjudication, because with adjudication comes funding to do the diagnosis. But I think the earlier that youth can get diagnosed when they first, before they're petitioned, then I think that's what you need to do. In Minnesota, we screen, state law requires screening of every child that enters foster care. And there's also a requirement that every foster parent have education on this. So a lot of this is getting your systems to start requiring screening. That's why when I mentioned the MACI 2, that's required in Minnesota that they do the MACI 2. That would be an easy time to, anytime they do a lot of, that's a mental health screen. And we know that a large percentage of youth with FASD have mental health. And so if they screen positive on that, then we found a large correlation. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Yeah, so we've got to get all the groups together and get some funding so that it's systematically
Yeah.
embedded.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and this is what we found as we do our advocacy, there's so many silos of funding. There's a lot of funding for behavioral health, mental health, and that's what we're trying to do, is to start to have FASD informed care put into those different silos. So, and that's going to be how systemically we can change the current trajectory.
I just have a comment. FASD excellence. You're absolutely correct. We need to bring it back because I'm also a birth mother. I have my daughter here, Hannah, and I benefited from that organization, and I benefited from the conferences and the presentations that was given when there was funding. And that's why I had opportunity to meet Dan Dabrowski. Well, I met him in Austin, Texas, but I think it's very important because if you look at FASD as a whole, it is still a solid epidemic because no one wants to talk about it. And it's as a mother, as a woman who's in long-term recovery, when my daughter got diagnosed, and the way I found out she was diagnosed was through the University of Washington when they sent me this big package in the mail. This is all before the internet was a craze and all. And I read everything and I said, this is my daughter, because my daughter was diagnosed with all different types of diagnosis and everything. And I just knew in my heart, that it was something bigger. And so Dan Dabrowski, he's right, strategies and teaching our kiddos, saying the good things instead of labeling them as bad children, right? And I did benefit from those strategies. My daughter was diagnosed when she was 4 years old, and I had parents that helped me, and everything that I learned through the University of Washington. My daughter's 27 years old, and she's thriving. I was told that she wasn't going to be able to do certain things, and she's really doing it, And so it's again, as I was telling my good friend, FASD is still a solid epidemic because mothers are shamed for what they did. And I honestly believe that no woman wakes up in the morning and says, well, today's the day I'm going to drink and hurt my child. Addiction's a disease. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
And I do want to thank you for bringing that up, because as we've done all these Zooms with members of Congress and their staff, we've tried to leave them with the message of hope and also getting away from the stigma. And one of the things that we've talked about is this prevalence study showed that it was binge drinking, the JAMA, binge drinking before recognition of pregnancy drove those numbers. And also there's the ABCD study that's a large cohort of over 10,000, and 26% of those, and that didn't include foster care, 26% had a high correlation between a checklist, problem behavior checklist, and prenatal alcohol exposure before recognition of pregnancy. So those are the kinds of things that we're giving to members of Congress and their staff and just to get away from the stigma, because that is what has hampered us through the history of this disability. So thank you for bringing that up.
I wanted to thank her also for her testimony, but the prevalence of autism is less than FASD, and yet the awareness is so much bigger. What can we learn from the autism world? And in the courts, are you seeing this? How do you handle that? What can we learn from them?
Well, I think that from my experience, the reason for that is that we have dismissed the stigma around autism. That 30 years ago, there was a lot of stigma around autism because it was thought that it was a refrigerator mother that caused autism. And I think what we can learn is that if we can get rid of the stigma around FASD, that it really is, it's been families fighting for the services for autism because they don't have the stigma. And we have the celebrities who are really out there and raising money for autism. And I think that that's really the key. And one of our colleagues from UCLA, I remember her saying that she has worked a lot with celebrities who have family members with FASD, could not get one of them to be a spokesperson. So I think that what we can learn is getting rid of the stigma and then being able to push for the kinds of funding and recognition of FASD. The other problem is we also have to fight the alcohol industry, which is very powerful, and the alcohol lobby is very powerful. And I think that that's the other piece that we need to address.
Can I just say something?
I think we're out of time. We're probably over. Where are we? Okay, no, we're going to go. Yes.
We get some more time because of the accent. Yes.
Yeah.
We'll listen to it forever.
Right. Thank you. Well, I think I just wanted to make a comment about the stigma. Dan, that was spot on, absolutely 100%. And it's just from the end of research I wanted to make these comments because I know we as researchers many times, I think if it'll be really useful to sort of modify the kind of language we employ in publications. And I say this from a place of experience. I was invited to review a paper very recently, and when I looked at the script, I think the author was well-meaning, but all around the transcript was reference to mother drinking. And I did reply saying respectfully that, well, I feel that this is contributing to the stigma, and this is not my opinion, this is also opinion from, the parents with lived experience. And I got the response back from the author of that paper saying, well, she's seen publications referring to mother, and she thinks it's right. And at that point, I thought, well, I think as researchers, probably we need a lesson or two from the seniors that have gone beyond to actually, just bring that together. We need to get our acts back. And I did reply, with proofs and sort of publications to say, no, this is not right. You can't keep referencing the mother because all you are doing is you are sort of just propagating the stigma the more we've referenced to that. So that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you, Dan, for that.
I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just trying to make sure there's enough time. Okay, nobody move because the next one's coming without a break, I think. So stay where you are. Thank you, everybody.